I was going to shut down my family bookstore, but the Indian rhinoceros saved it.
That's a rare bird.
In my travels through Kaziranga, I saw the jungle growing again, and I heard the story of the rhino.
50 years ago, there were only 400 rhinos. But now, there are more than 2,400.
India showed me what can happen if you don't give up. And if the Indian rhino can make a comeback in this day and age, so can my bookstore.
Incredible India.
Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and good morning to my colleagues in the United States. We welcome you to the third day of lecture series based on the books on princely states or Indian states of Gujarat. My name is Dr. Maitri Vaidya Sabnis, and I am one of the chief editors along with Dr. Kenneth Robbins, who is also the first speaker of these three lectures that we'll be listening in this evening. Dr. Robbins, who needs no introduction, now will be speaking on Maharajas, Nawabs, Thakurs, other princes and chiefs beyond number. May I request Dr. Robbins to please deliver the lecture.
Thank you. We have produced these 3 volumes about the states of Gujarat and these 7 lectures. Next week, we have a formidable showing of different subjects. We start off by talking about patronage and paintings. We've located whole new schools, we've located whole new schools of miniature paintings and produced dozens of wall paintings, ranging from palaces to temples all across the states of Gujarat. We talked about the patronage of an amazing man, Maharaja Sayaji Rao III. On Tuesday, we switch to 2 different subjects: the port history of Gujarat and the economic history of Baroda. We have a special treat on Wednesday because we're going to see an anthropological film by a professor from Temple University, who just happens to be the Maharaja of Drangadra. And he's going to discuss 1,000 years of his family's history. And he is, of course, also the head of the Jala Rajput clan. And I will introduce him by talking about briefly about some of the other clans. And on the last day, we will have people like Bill Richter talking about what happened to the princes in the early heady days of independence. Oh, it's not working again. I want to go back to our original subject, which is that there were hundreds of Maharajas, Nawabs, Darbar Sahibs, Thakurs, and princes and chiefs in what is today Gujarat. In a memorandum on the Indian states in 1939, there were 369 states, talukas, and estates in political relationships with residents, political agents, and agencies. But there were also 168 civil stations and non-jurisdictional talukas under Thana circles. So what we're talking about is a number of 537 states, and the number of states kept on changing as we went. So what we've seen during this time was that different people have claimed different things, and it's partially how they counted it and what year they were talking about. For example, one expert says there were 157 states in Gujarat that merged into Bombay, and 449 states in Kathiawar made Saurashtra. The same author says there were 606 states in Gujarat, Kathiawar alone. According to another historian, 361 of the 629 states were in the Bombay presidency, which included Western India. And on and on and on. To make it clear, in the area we're talking about, the largest state, Baroda, had a population of almost 2.5 million. And there was tiny Bilbari, which had 27 people. When we talk about the levels of rule, we talk about the levels of rule on 3 bases. One were imperial states that claimed domination over the whole area. And then there were smaller states, and then there were microstates. Now, in the 19th and 20th century, there began to be a period of trying to recover the idea that no Hindu had ruled over this whole area for hundreds of years. And in 1866, there was a historical novel about the last Hindu ruler of Gujarat, written by a prime minister of Kutch state. How do I go back now? So after the fall of that Hindu dynasty, there were a series of foreign Muslims invaders who took over as imperial overlords of Gujarat. First, the Sultans of Delhi, then the breakaway Sultans of Gujarat, who were then taken over by the Mughals. Now, it's important if we talk about Muslim rule to realize that even during this period, there were a number of states that were ruled by Rajputs and other Hindus, and a number of states that were established during these times. States like Jamnagar and Drole, and Chota Udaipur and Baria, and so on and so forth. And at this time, we began to see the establishment of the first smaller ruled states in Gujarat. Also, as imperial power waned, the local officials, Mughal officials, sought to establish their own states. So we have the descendants of Jafar Khan, a Babi Pathan, who held high offices in Gujarat and Madhya Pradesh, who acquired what became Junagadh and Radanpur and Balasanur and Manavadar. The Mughal governors of 2 of the big port cities, one we're hearing about today, Surat, made themselves independent. These port cities became independent entities that didn't last very long. But it's also important to understand that the Mughal officials also included Hindus. And the younger brother of one of the viceroys was a Ratha Rajput, and he created the state of Idar. So we have continuing rule on the local level in some areas by Muslims. With the 19th century, we see the Marathas coming into the picture. And first of all, the Peshwas and the Gaekwads were in league with each other and also in rivalry. And of course, the Gaekwads won and created the great state of Baroda. One of the problems that was happening then is the way the system worked, the most powerful could claim tribute from lesser rulers. Now, when a fellow named Alexander Walker came, he changed the whole situation. What would happen is every year there were military expeditions that were sent to extract tribute from subordinate rulers. So these subordinate rulers were faced with that threat, also from the threats of military action by dispossessed relatives or by other people who had no way of sustaining themselves and would raid. So we have produced the documentation of this in these books, showing, for example, the various raids by Cathys at the end of the 18th century on Bhavnagar and how this thing. What Alexander Walker did in the so-called Walker settlement, he said, look, he tried to rationalize this system. Look, the petty chiefs, you will pay the money. You will keep the peace in your place. In return for this, the tribute will be not collected. So this reestablished order, but it produced a tremendous fragmentation of political authority. To understand this process, states continue to fall and rise. Today, we are fortunate to have with us Darbar Sahib, Nawab Mir Jafar Ali Imam, my good friend, who is the Nawab of Kamadhia, a small state formed in the 19th century. And he's also going to tell you about his connection to the demise of Surat, and an amazing story of how his ancestor defeated the British in Parliament. And he's going to be joined by his son, Moin Mir, and Moin has just produced an incredible book about this story. So we see the production of continuing problems with very small states. And we try to document as many of these states as we can. How many of you have heard of Kadal or Mangani or Panadra or Zainabad, and so on and so forth. Also, one of the things that we noticed when we tried to map this out is that the Cathys, after who Kathiawar, of course, is named, ruled some of the small states in India. They didn't rule any of the largest 18 states which had gun salutes. They ruled smaller non-gun salute states. The largest population was Jasdan, which had a population of 24,000. We're not going to speak about the Jalas because we're going to do that on next Wednesday. And we're going to speak about all the Rajput clans. But there were Rajput rulers throughout the centuries in India. For example, in Junagadh, there were Rajputs ruling before the Babi Pathans took over. And which were the dominant groups of Rajputs clans changed over time. The next thing I wanted to say is, how do we understand what these states were? So we tried to make a chart describing how these kings came out, trying to account for all the factors. So if we had 7 lectures, we couldn't go over how all these states rose and fell. Some of them started with a guy who raised a body of followers. Other times it was clan or tribal or religious groups that leaders. They tended to plunder. They needed money to pay their troops, and even states like Baroda had a lot of problems and had to depend upon outside financing. And very often these states were financed by bankers who advanced cash against future revenues. So this was a very unstable sort of thing, and people kept power in any way that they could. So you can understand why these people not only wanted to hold power, but why they needed legitimization. So my own personal idea is that states and Marathas were not very different kind, only in relative success in conquest, revenue collection, infrastructure building, and recognition by superior powers. They were all involved in the same process, using the same sources of legitimization. And so I undertook to document some of this. For example, and this is a painting from the Swami Narayan movement from a place called Vatal. which was the base of a leader of a large, quote, criminal gang that drove the Baroda government crazy. But here he's seen as a disciple in the Swami Narayan movement, and he's seen alongside rulers of small states, including one who was also Prime Minister of Junagadh, and two small Kathi rulers, one of whom, with Sahajanand Swami, lived for years. So we can see that how was a ruler and who was seen as Maratha sometimes were confused. This is important when we discuss the things like 1857, 1858, because then you can see them on several different levels. The first of all is the fight against the British. So one of the things that we documented was how the British disarmed in 1857, 1858, whenever things were getting bad. They disarmed the local populations. And this is a list of the hundreds of thousands of weapons that they took away from the population. The British did this, but also you have to understand at this time they tend to favor Baroda and Maharajas against landlords and outlaws. So this is the exact opposite of what was going on 50 years before, when the Walker settlement favored the small landlords with permanent settlements of tribute and assurances about land tenure. These petty landlords then agreed to keep the peace and compensate for robberies committed. When this didn't happen, the British often attacked them. There were certain groups that were not seen as potential rulers. This is important because by defining these groups in a different way, they then became outside of the system. This is particularly true in our area of two groups, the so-called Beals and the Waygars. The Waygars were in Okramandal, which was nominally under the control of Baroda, but they had a lot of trouble controlling it. They also engaged in piracy, claimed that they were rulers of the area, and they also expected pensions to keep them from doing bad things. The British response to this was to stigmatize them, to make said they were plunderers and they were lawlessness, and they couldn't be civilized into honest industry. So they were stigmatized by the British. And during the period of the First Indian War for Independence, the Waygars rose. They went in a particular direction. They went outside Okramandal, where they were based, and in the direction of the Gir Forest. They were raiders, and so on and so forth. So they would do things like they would fleece the Banyas and spend the loot feasting the Brahmins. And they tried to get an ancestry that they were of the warrior caste. And they, at the same time, they tried to get the support of the low caste, and so on and so forth. So these Waygars were not that different than the other groups. This was also true of the Beals, who were supposedly in the forest. They over and over and over again were involved in rebellions. This is a monument for the 1913 massacre of 1,500 Beals at a fair at the Mangara Hills. That's near Sunthranpur, not Rampur, the big state, but Sunthranpur. And so we have documentation of how these people with bows and arrows fought. What's important is that we reassess the history to include these people, and the question of who were these people in the forest? Were they really different, or were they people who were seeking to sustenance by being dacoits or rebels? We are currently seeing a reassessment of the history of these people. And there's a TV series, which I haven't been able to see here in America, but they define these groups in different ways. They say the Wagars were rulers of Acamando. They were a major landowning community in Jawarka, and restrictions on their trade and taxes compelled them to become daring pirates. And the Beals were people who supposedly lived in the woods and the hills, and they had good relations supposedly with the Marathas and the Rajputs. You know, for example, if you look at the coat of arms of Mewar, you'll see that there's a Beal as well as a Rajput, and so on. But the politics changed because of, as the British tore down some of the forest. And the Beals rebelled against this. So we have to reassess that. Let me end this talk on a happier note. We've tried to cover the poetry of this. We're particularly interested in the cross-regional sorts of contacts, cultural contacts particularly. For example, the influence of Tanjore dancing on the Baroda court, music of that. In Kutch, we have a tremendous center for Braj Bhasha work, and there was a whole school teaching people how to be bards. Started in the 18th century by the great Lakpachi, Rao of Kutch. And the poet that I think is the most interesting was Dal Patram, who came from Wadwan. And it's interesting that he, first of all, was involved with the Swami Narayans, who sent him to Bhuj. He had a hard time finding patronage as a court poet, and he appeared in Wadwan, Drangadra, Wankanir, Idar, I can't remember, was Bhavnagar or something like that, Bhavnagar, yeah, until he met a English judge who then discovered the Bardic literature of Gujarat. And this fellow Forbes became his patron and friend. And Dalpat became the first, quote, modern writer in the Gujarati language. And of course, the most famous, we couldn't stop without the book, without a chapter to Kalapi, who in real life was a Thakur of Pathi, as well as a great poet. He was a poet of beautiful love poetry and passion for a woman. And of course, there's a famous movie about him, the picture of which is shown on the right-hand side. And lastly, we're going to be talking today, we have our first glimpse at Maratha women when Maitri Devi, when we're going to hear about the Queens of Baroda. And the question that we should start to be asking is, why were there so many powerful in the 18th and 19th century, why in 20th century, so many powerful women leaders, not only in Baroda, but particularly in Kolhapur, Indore, and Savantwadi. Thank you very much. Maitri, should I introduce, or would you prefer to introduce the next speaker?
I think you can do the job better than me.
I know Mir Jaffa Iman for many years, and I first met him when I was giving a lecture on a book that I wrote on African elites in India. And a man came up to me and had sheets, had taken notes on the whole book. And that is how we first met and have become close friends, he and his wife and niece, and his son and daughter-in-law. He is a descendant of the Shistis. He is a Urdu poet, and the most amazing thing was quite recently, Moin and I attended a ceremony consecrating a cross for peace at Westminster Abbey. The service was led by former Archbishop of Canterbury. And of course, there was one person, outsider, who was allowed to give a prayer. And with the permission of the Queen, my friend Mir Jaffa Iman was able to give a prayer in honor of Jesus as the first Muslim to pray in Westminster Abbey. So let me turn it over to Moin and Jaffa. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Deeply touched and honored to have been asked to speak at this very distinguished and esteemed panel. With permission from my father, I will continue unless and until you want to take the lead and do a little bit about, talk a little bit about Surat and your birth in that wonderful city and how you grew up, and then I could lead into the history of Surat as a state. Would you like to do that?
Well, I think, Moin, you can continue, and I will come in as and when required to fill in the gaps, you could say so.
Okay, thank you. Once again, a huge honor to be amongst all of you today. Dr. Maitri, Ken, and all the other esteemed panelists. I seek your forgiveness if I haven't got all the names right, but thank you very much for having my father and me on your talk this afternoon, or this evening rather, in India. I thought it would be wonderful to start off a little bit about how Surat came into existence as an independent ruling principality, talk a little bit about its ascendancy and how it was extinguished by the English East India Company as it was gaining prominence and ascendancy in Western India. After which I will link that story to the rise of the Prince of Surat, who was also the prince of a tiny state called Kamadhia, and how it actually got prominence. Most importantly, how it culminated in a brilliant and dazzling victory for an Indian in the Houses of Parliament in Britain, a feat that was never accomplished and has remained unmatched till today. So a little bit about Surat. Surat came into prominence, I would suspect sometime in the 13th or 14th centuries, primarily because of its fantastic location, where it found itself. It just found itself geographically in such a potent position, located on the Tapti, on the banks of the Tapti, and then opening out into the Arabian Sea. And as a result, through time, it gained immense prominence as a trading hub, as a port. Its rise also was driven by the fact that the sultans who ruled Surat before the Mughals came into the picture propelled and galvanized that city into a cosmopolitan hub, which basically meant that because trade had to thrive and prosper and in many ways drive the income of that entire region and feed into Delhi as well, they encouraged a wide network of seeking businessmen and seeking traders. That basically meant you had a vast number of Portuguese, Dutch, English, Turks, Baghdadi Jews, obviously the locals, all trading out of this extraordinary port. And sometimes, I often get asked, how would Surat have been back in those days? And one can only jog one's memory or probably, cultivate a more fertile and imaginative mind to imagine that Surat must have very well rivaled Venice. and Surat could very well have been, one of the trendsetters, if you wish, of global trade and global business, where its fantastic diaspora and its fantastically cross-pollinated mix of businessmen, traders, ship-owning merchants brought such a great vivacity to the city. I would also like to comment that the master writer, probably and arguably the greatest writer that one has had the good fortune of reading, Leo Tolstoy, had mentioned Surat, and Leo Tolstoy had this mad, insane urge to visit Surat. So the fame of Surat had spread, that far. But of course, Leo Tolstoy lived in the 19th century, so that had,
And let me come in here, Moin. In fact, Leo Tolstoy wrote a little short story based on the port of Surat, where he has described all these merchants the way you've been talking about them so far. So his story, which is based on the port, is a very, very interesting story. One of his best short stories written so far.
That's right. And that bears testimony to the fact that Surat was truly, truly and unimpeachably the most international of Indian cities that one could have asked. Yes, of course, there was Delhi and, much later Calcutta and all of that. But what really gets neglected is that how international Surat was. Anyways, time passes by, and you have an extraordinary amount of political turmoil that grips Europe, with the descendancy of the Ottoman Empire, who already had their ships trading in the Arabian Sea, and clashing with the Portuguese and the Dutch in the Mediterranean. You had the ascendancy of the Portuguese and the Dutch, who had made their way into the Arabian Sea, jostling and grappling for space, with the British. And while all of that was going on in that space, up in North India, a new power dynamic had taken shape, and that was in the form of the Mughals. And the Mughals had, taken Delhi from the Lodhis and, all of that. And I won't get into the details of Humayun and Akbar, because that a lot has been written about them. But at some point in time in the 16th century, Akbar turns his attention to Surat, and he captures Surat and he takes it from the Sultan of Surat. And it's a fascinating encounter, because it's the first time that the Mughal emperor is put on a boat and sent out into the seas, opening from the Tapti, and he goes into the Arabian Sea. And for the first time, coming in from a landlocked country like Central Asia, he sees the magnificence of the seas, and he builds the Mughal fleet. And it's under the governorship of Akbar and Jahangir, and later on even Shah Jahan, that Surat continues to thrive as this extraordinary trading port and trading hub. What the Mughals do rather astutely and quite politically is that they break and they divide the command in Surat. And of course, that's politically driven. What they do is that they have the fort, which is called the Killa, or the fort area, which is on the banks of the Tapti. And that is administered by the Kiledar, who actually collects the taxes, ensures that all the ships are docked correctly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and ensures that trading happens brilliantly. And then they have the Mutasaddi, or the governor of the city, who actually looks after civil administration. Now, what this policy does basically is that it ensures that Surat is not in one particular, under one governor. It's a divided control reporting into the Mughal emperor. As a result of that, the governorship of the city continues to be quite stable, as well as the Kiledar continues to be, doing his job quite well. What really gets the ball rolling in terms of a sense of displacement is when Aurangzeb dies in 1707 and the Mughal Empire starts collapsing. Now, as the Mughal Empire starts collapsing, a large number of princes raise their banner of independence and they become independent. For example, Bengal becomes independent. Major provinces spin away and they break away as well. And as the Mughal Empire is beginning its end, or hurtling towards its end, sometime in 1733, one of the soldiers of fortune of the Mughal Empire, a man named Tegh Khan, makes his way towards Surat, which is actually now facing a sense of anarchy, because you have the East India Company, which has already got the license to trade from Jahangir, and it had already got its ships there. The Dutch were already in Surat trading because they had a license from the Mughals to trade. The Portuguese were already trading. And because of this vacuum that was being created with the demise of the Mughal Empire, Surat was not being managed quite well. And you had all of these foreign powers now jostling for space. The East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, the Portuguese, all of that. And then, of course, you know, the overarching fact that it was a divided control between Kiledar and Mutasaddi meant that there wasn't any, you know, consolidated rule. Tegh Khan comes in sometime in 1733. He brings order to Surat. And for the first time, Surat comes under one unified rule. And he declares himself Nawab of Surat. So you have the fort of Surat and the governorship of Surat coming directly under the control of Tegh Khan. And he immediately sounds the threat of the East India Company, particularly the English East India Company. And he realizes that the greatest threat to Western India is the rise of the East India Company rather than any other you know, offshoots or any other you know, splintered princes looking at Surat with envious eyes. And as a result of that, he increases the taxation on the East India Company. And the East India Company responds with, you know, great force, and they create a blockade. And then Tegh Khan reacts with another mighty blockade of their ships. So all of this toing and froing continues, where Surat, you know, while it's still thriving as a port city, you can sense that these are the first signs of anarchy, and these are the first signs of, you know, a sense of decline in trade that's going to happen. Obviously, coupled also with the fact that that there is a fair amount of silting that is happening in the Tapti. So you've got all these kind of factors that are coming into play. A sense of political anarchy. Geographically, Surat is beginning to, you know, feel the heat with silting of the Tapti happening. But nevertheless, as long as Tegh Khan seems to be there, there seems to be some sense of unified control. It's only after his death that things get out of hand. And unfortunately, his brother Safdar and his cousins start fighting amongst each other. His son-in-law Muinuddin tries to bring a sense of calm, if I may, to the city, and a healing touch. He's rallied behind by the merchants, the Hindus, the Boras, the Portuguese. Oddly enough, even the English East India Company rally behind Muinuddin and say
the Jains in particular rallied around. Yeah. You see, the Jain businessmen were very powerful.
Yeah, the Jain merchants were hugely impactful in Surat. And so there's this merchant alliance, this fantastic merchant alliance of Jains, Hindus, Boras, Muslims, even you know, for example, the Portuguese, who suddenly realized that the East India Company can be booted out. They rally behind Muinuddin and make him the Nawab of Surat. While all of this is going on, there still continues to be political family intrigue, and that starts eating away at a unified command. But like his father-in-law, Muinuddin very quickly realizes that it is the East India Company that might be the most potential, the largest threat to taking over Surat. And in what is an astonishing alliance, Nawab Muinuddin reaches out to the Gaikwad of Baroda, and he reaches out to the Nizam of Hyderabad. And for the first time, this fabulous alliance of the Gaikwad of Baroda, the Nizam of Hyderabad, and the Nawab of Surat come together as one to take on the East India Company, as well as the Dutch Company, to keep them at bay. In fact, the Nizam of Hyderabad sends his envoy and says that I will ensure that my army comes and protects you and Surat and helps you fight in case you have to. The Gaikwad of Baroda says, I will send 5,000 Marathas to support you against the English East India Company. And this is a lesser known part of history where, you know, Surat is championed, if you wish, by the Nawab, by the Nizam and the Gaikwad, all coming together to form an alliance against the East India Company. Anyways, as time passes by, Muinuddin dies and that alliance breaks. His son comes to the Gaddi, who's Hafizuddin. And it's at that point in time when I think the Gaikwad has also passed away, the Nizam has also passed away, and there are new political alliances that are happening. And the East India Company use full power to kind of push back Nawab Hafizuddin's dominance in Surat. But to cut the long story short, what the East India Company officials were basically able to do was to use cash to bribe local officials to ensure that, you know, trading happened the way they did. So basically, if a ship had to go out, it had to pay the East India Company officials who had taken over the dock, and Nawab Hafizuddin had no longer control over the dock. As we progress towards 1779, I happened to chance upon a letter, 1773, my apologies, which Nawab Hafizuddin writes to the directors of the East India Company in London. And in my book, I quote that letter where he is scathing of the corrupt English East India Company officials. And he says that they've broken all kinds of treaties. They're taking all kinds of bribes to diminish the trading power of Surat. And why were they doing that? Because they had Bombay. Don't forget, the East India Company inherited the string of little islands just 150 miles south of Surat called Bombay from the Portuguese. And they wanted to counter Surat and build Bombay as a trading nemesis to Surat, which basically meant they were continuously bribing merchants, bribing trading officials to get them to trade out of Bombay so that Surat could capsize. And this fantastic letter from Hafizuddin, which is at the British Library in London, is almost pleading the directors of the East India Company to ensure that the bribing in Surat stops. Anyways, as all of this happens, you know, Hafizuddin dies and his son Nizamuddin comes, but Nizamuddin dies as well. And then Nawab Nasiruddin comes. This is the first time that you see the doctrine of lapse being tested out in India. We are talking about 1799 when Wellesley has come in as the Governor General of India. He has defeated Tipu Sultan in Mysore. East India Company has been established as one of the most powerful, armies in the subcontinent. And as a result of that, Wellesley, after defeating Tipu, turns his attention to Surat. He realizes that Nawab Nizamuddin has died without a male heir, but he's left a younger brother, and the younger brother should succeed to the throne. But this is the first time that the doctrine of lapse is tested out in India. You know, we think of the doctrine of lapse being used in 1857, but the first time it was tested out or laboratory tested was in 1799 when Wellesley turns his attention to Surat and says, no, the Nawab has died without a son, and we're not going to let his younger brother succeed. We're going to take over the entire city of Surat. Nawab Nasiruddin at that time contemplates armed resistance, but is prevailed upon by his secretary that there is no way you could match the firepower of Wellesley and the East India Company that is now docking at the port. And finally, he's compelled to sign a treaty where he and his family for generations would be paid £15,000, and they would be allowed to keep their estates. Now, the personal estates of the Nawab basically constituted nearly a third of Surat, which basically meant it provided employment for weavers, for potters, for craftsmen, for all kinds of arts and cultural activities. and many palaces and gardens, which Nasiruddin wanted to make into public affairs as well. But realizing that there was no way out, Nawab Nasiruddin signs the treaty, and Surat falls in 1800. So it is in 1800, after the defeat of Tipu Sultan, that Surat is finally annexed by the English East India Company by force, using the doctrine of lapse. Nawab Nasiruddin is allowed to keep his title, he's allowed to keep his estates, and he's allowed to keep, he's said that he would be paid £15,000 for generation to generation. As Surat falls, and Surat as a port kind of ceases to exist, and Bombay, grows in prominence, and in a very kind of twist of fate, Surat kind of takes a backseat, at least as far as maritime trade is concerned. But Surat is still a powerhouse when it comes to an astonishing amount of textiles, of craftsmanship, and all of that kind of monetary generation.
Let me come in here for a minute, Moin. The important point is also that the British lured the merchants to come to Surat, from Surat to Bombay, by giving them various advantages in Mumbai. And you will see that a lot of Parsi businessmen also started, there was shipbuilding which used to be there, started in Bombay, and many of the merchants slowly started moving to Bombay from Surat.
That's right. Here, this is where, my book, or for that matter, the history of Surat, takes a very, a bit of a different turn. Having signed away his ruling powers, but still a third of Surat being the private property of the Nawab, which is an extraordinary amount of real estate, Nawab Nasiruddin dies and is succeeded by his son, Nawab Afzaluddin. Afzaluddin, for all practical purposes, is a lovable man, given to poetry, but also given to opium, also given to liquor, also given to enjoyment of his harem. And as a result, he realizes that he doesn't have the responsibility of administering the city. He's being paid £15,000 a year, which is an extraordinary amount of money. He's got these lavish estates which provide employment to the people of Surat, but still they are his private property, and all he has to do is while away his time. To further add to the problem is that Nawab Afzaluddin has only one surviving daughter. And this is where things start getting a little murky, at least with the English East India Company, because as he's aging, Nawab Afzaluddin realizes that on his death, the English East India Company might play tricks again, get up to their tricks, not recognize his daughter, because of doctrine of lapse, and what would happen to a third of Surat, which was his private property, which most importantly provided an enormous amount of employment to the people of Surat. And so begins this extraordinary search to find a male heir. He initially welcomes the two princes from the Delhi court, the sons of the emperor, who actually come and paint an abysmal figure, because they find themselves lost in the opium dens, completely drunk, absolutely whiling away their to-be father-in-law's money. And the Nawab sees himself in them, and he rejects them and he sends them back to Delhi, quite disappointed. But not prepared to give up, he continues to look for, there's a term called Rajwada, which basically means a prince from Gujarat. And finally, he zeroes in on a very small principality in Kathiawar called Kamadhia. And the prince of that principality had the title of Darbar Sahib. They were descendants of the Chishti, the Sufi Chishti order, and they had been given this principality by the penultimate Mughal emperor. And the prince of that tiny small principality had distinguished himself in battle against the dacoits, the Makrani dacoits who had come in from Makran and laid havoc in the peninsula of Kathiawar. He chooses this young prince. The name of this prince is Mir Jafar Ali, and he adopts him. He officially adopts him as his son and his successor. But something is still amiss. And he's worried that although he's adopted him officially as his successor, he might not be accepted on his death. So he gets him married to his daughter. The reason being, he thinks that on his death, if they don't accept the adopted son, they'll have to accept the adopted daughter. They'll have to accept the daughter. If they don't accept the daughter, they'll have to accept the adopted son. So it's a win-win situation for the Nawabship. And Elphinstone, who's the governor of Bombay Presidency, writes to Nawab of Surat saying that we have no interest in interfering in your estates and in your family succession. Whatever you choose to do will be accepted. Receiving that letter, Nawab of Surat is more than happy, continues to live a life of opulence, flings himself into the opium dens, and it is rumored that he dies of an overdose. When he dies, this is where the problem starts. The English East India Company swing in and they realize that a third of Surat can be captured immediately. They stop the pension of £15,000. They capture every palace, every garden is usurped by them. And the young prince and his wife and their daughter is thrown into a somewhat of a dungeon-like apartment to live their lives.
In the Aina Mahal.
Yes. Not only is this a breach of the treaty of 1800, where for generation to generation the estates would be maintained, this also means that a large population of Surat suffers from unemployment, and it feeds into the greed of the English East India Company, who want to auction off a third of Surat and fill their coffers. In what goes on to become probably the greatest counterattack, legal counterattack against the English East India Company, Mir Jafar Ali, who is the Darbar of Kamadhia and the supposed to be Nawab of Surat, leaves for Britain. And he goes to fight the East India Company in their own, on their own turf. In his first visit to London, the English press is completely smitten by this, tall Gujarati prince. And the Times of London writes huge articles about how good-looking this Gujarati prince is and how he's, how he's stepping up into the social society of London and the balls that he's invited for and all the theatre that he's been attending. But the minute he goes into the East India Company headquarters and says, I'm not here to have a good time, I'm here to actually put my case in front of you people so that justice can be done and a third of Surat is returned to the family, as well as the pension is restored, his claims are rejected. He lives in England for 8 months and fails completely. When he returns to Surat, he realizes that every single palace, and it's such a tragedy because if those palaces were standing today, they could have rivaled and matched the beautiful palaces of Rajasthan that we all take great pride in. Every single palace was crumbling. There was no money to maintain them. There was massive scales of unemployment. Stable boys were not being paid. A large number of textile workshops had to be closed down. Pottery shops had to be closed down. And there was a sense of utter despair in 1/3 of Surat. It is after great consideration that he mortgages 2 or 3 villages of his and goes back to England and tries to get a hearing with the English East India Company. Unfortunately, he fails again. But here is where the story takes a complete turn. He's invited to the Lodestar event, social event of Britain, which is the Ascot horse racing. And he happens to go there in these finely attired, textile clothes woven in Surat. And he catches the eye of a very young Queen Victoria who's sitting in a box right next to him. And she looks at this Indian prince who's standing at 6 feet tall and she says, my God, who is he? I want to get introduced to him. And finally, somehow an introduction happens between this Gujarati prince and the Queen of Britain. He has about 5 minutes to tell her why he's in Britain, and he very quickly, through his secretaries, is able to convey the reason why he's here. She's utterly moved. At this point in time, Queen Victoria is beginning to get a sense of the misgovernance of the English East India Company. And in a charming moment, she appoints the most powerful lawyer in Britain, Sir Richard Kelly, who's also her Attorney General, to fight the case of the Nawab of Surat in the Houses of Parliament. It is something that had never been done, and it was something that had never been expected, that a bill would be tabled in the House of Commons and in the House of Lords for the reinstatement of the pension of the Nawab of Surat, as well as the reinstatement of the third of the estates. So you can imagine.
But let me come in here. One of the things the British East India Company did was also to abolish the title of the Nawab of Surat. Besides taking away the pension and the estates, they officially abolished the title of the Nawab of Surat. That's a very important point which is to be noted.
That's right. The title of the Nawab of Surat was abolished in 1842, immediately after the death of Afzaluddin.
Exactly.
And there was no Nawab of Surat that was going to happen from then on. It was only going to be descendants. But coming back then to this rather charming aspect of the story where Queen Victoria is quite enamored by this Indian prince, and she hands over her lawyers for him to fight. He goes into the House of Commons in 1854 parliamentary sessions as the only Indian to enter the Houses of Parliament to take on the English East India Company. Now, it's important to understand that the House of Commons and the House of Lords is made up of members of Parliament who are also shareholders in the East India Company. So you can imagine the political dynamics that is playing out in the Parliament of Britain. You have, close to 300 members of Parliament, half of which are stakeholders in the East India Company. And here is a bill that is being tabled in the Houses of Commons to admonish the practices of the East India Company. And there are incredible debates that last for close to 3 years. Time after time, the hearing is told, the bill is not sent up for hearing, and it seems like a lost battle. Finally, in 1856, just before the mutiny in 1857, the bill is heard in the House of Commons. And after what is considered by many a landmark moment in British Indian history, majority of the House of Commons votes in favor of an Indian and against the English East India Company, which is the machine of empire expansion. It is the only time that Britain voted for an Indian and against their own company. It was never done before, and it never happened again. And at the end of the day, the pension was restored, and the estates were given back to the family. The foresight of Mir Jafar Ali, the Darbar of Kamadhia, was such that he even went on to establish the first textile mill, the first cotton weaving mill in Surat.
And his shipping company, which had ships between Surat and Bombay, passenger ship.
Yeah. And so that was how I wrote my book, Surat, Fall of a Port, Rise of a Prince. It was a story that needed to be told about how Surat fell to the East India Company, and also about how this incredible young prince of Kathiawar becomes the only Indian prince to defeat the East India Company in their own parliament. So that's me.
I would like you to
there any questions
about Kamadhia. Moin, I would like you to say something more about Kamadhia, because it's the Kamadhia prince who finally wins the war, you see, in the parliament. So please tell us something more about Kamadhia state.
So Kamadhia, as I mentioned, was the tiny principality. It consisted only of 4 villages, quite like what Ken was saying, a large number of principalities, but some very large, some very small, some utterly diminutive, some infinitesimally small, and Kamadhia was one of those. It was a tiny, tiny principality of only 4 villages, just off the riverbanks of Badar, not very far from Gondal. The title was the Darbar Sahib of Kamadhia. The Darbargarh of Kamadhia was a wonderfully sweet little palace. It continued to enjoy quasi civil jurisdictional powers right up till 1947, when my great-grandfather signed Kamadhia to the Indian Union, and it became part of the Indian Union in 1947.
Instrument of accession was signed by my grandfather
in 1947, and the instrument of accession is something that
1948, I think.
Yeah, and that instrument of accession is something which my father and I hold very dearly. When we signed to the Indian Union, and Kamadhia became a part of that, and it continues to be a place where my father and I visit, and we have wonderful memories of beautiful neem trees and bougainvillea by the river, utterly charming. So yeah, that's the story of Surat and Kamadhia.
I would like to add a little bit more, if you are there, and because how Kamadhia came into existence is another story, because Mir Sarfaraz Ali, which was one of the great noblemen of the Sahswari dynasty connected with the Mughals and pre-Mughals families, Kamadhia was given originally as Jagir to Mir Sarfaraz Ali under the seal of Akbar, the Emperor Akbar Shah II. And that was only in 1818 that it was recognized as a ruling state. Am I right, boy?
That's right. That's right. Thank you so much. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Moin Mir. I think we are really intrigued already. And I would request all of the audience and the viewers to, I think they should go to the market and order your book online if they would prefer that way, because it is so interesting.
That's very kind, Doctor.
Gee. So basically, I want to talk a bit and then we'll move to the next lecture. So I had met Nawab Sahab with Dr. Robbins when the idea of the book was taking shape. His contribution to these volumes is immense, as both Nawab Sahab and Mr. Akshay Chauhan had taken care of shaping the third volume, and which in my opinion is the most beautiful of the three books that have come out. As is already noted that Nawab Sahab is the scion of the erstwhile state of Kamadhia, and he has in fact worked very hard to restore the heritage buildings to its former glory. I think we had a telephonic conversation, I think two to 3 years ago, when he had informed me and invited me very kindly to visit. So the lecture, in fact, has thrown a very important light on history of Surat. We often repeat the narrative about looking at history from what has come to be known as the Eurocentric perspective. We have so far read about Surat as an important trading center because of the presence of European companies. However, your work, in fact, brings the lens closer and shows a clearer picture. As it turns out, the Kamadhia state, it was one of the most progressive states, not we can say very progressive because it was a very tiny state, but as much as they could do with it, they did, and especially in the early 20th century. And I have also read a bit about it, about the administrative reforms that were carried out. In fact, as you've already mentioned, that when the time came for integration of states with the Indian Union, then I think that then Nawab had decided to join with the Dominion of India without any issues. So what happens is usually when we talk about the Indian states or Indian princely states, the narratives often focus on the problems created by the states during the time of integration and how the government actually had to really make a lot of efforts to get these rulers to sign the instrument of accession. But this particular, let's say, example can be made before the students that this was not the case with every state. In fact, Kamadhia was one of the states which had sacrificed their personal benefits for the cause of the united country, a great nation. So therefore, thank you very much for the lecture that you delivered. I think all of us have benefited a lot from it. So now I would like to invite the third speaker of the day. And in fact, I'm quite proud and honored to introduce this last speaker of today's session, Professor Aruna Awasthi. Professor Awasthi is the head Department of History, Faculty of Arts, the Maharajas University of Baroda. She's, I think, one of the most popular heads that have come to the department, that have led the department. And the department has really grown under her. But this is only administrative achievement. If you look at her academic achievements, I think they are greater. So she has, to her credit, great many books and articles. And although her specialization is on history of railways, but her passion is about history of women. She has worked on writing women back in the mainstream historical discourse. Apart from merely writing women back, she in fact has floated this very interesting course on history of women in the department. So she talks about different methods through which budding historians can explore this particular idea. So today she'll be talking about the Maharanis of Baroda. Without wasting much time, may I introduce Professor Awasthi. In fact, may I invite her to kindly deliver your lecture. Ma'am.
Thank you so much, Maitri. It's always a pleasure to be a part of such august gatherings. And I think you have put me on a pedestal, and now it's very difficult to live up to that ideal. But I'll try my best and make sure that I'm able to convert my passion into something academic.
Afasi, thank you, please. Over.
First of all, I would like to say good evening to all the scholars from India and good morning to all those from USA. I would like to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to present my views and findings in front of such an august gathering. And as Dr. Maitri has already said, my field of interest and research for the last 35 years has been railroads. But gender concerns and studies are my passion, and they will continue to be so. Keeping in tune with the theme of this lecture series on princely states of Gujarat, my talk is focused on the political influence of Maharanis in Baroda state. It is widely known that Baroda was one of the most progressive princely states in India. This is possible because of the progressive rule of Maharaja Sayajirao III. Innumerable works have been authored on Sayajirao III, but the contributions of Maharanis in governance of the state and welfare of the society have remained outside the mainstream historical discourse. Therefore, the aim of this article, which has been written in the book and also of this talk, is to present a well-balanced gender telescopic view of the erstwhile Gaikwad state. Women's political participation was of diverse dimensions, such as regents for their sons, consorts of the husbands, diplomats for the fathers, and ruling brothers. They strategized, they planned, and operated to preserve their positions in a male-dominated court. In the 19th century, before the Baroda state was formed or founded, Umabai Davde, widow of Khandera, who was supposed to be the Senapati of the Maratha forces that overtook Gujarat by storm. She fought for the rights of her son and successfully commanded her royal troops to protect her son, Yasantwara Davde. And while she was alive, her rival, Dhammaji Rao could not make much headway into Gujarat. Involvement of Maharanis in the political affairs increased after Dhammaji Rao's death in 1768. Dhammaji Rao Gaikwad had 4 legitimate sons with rights to the gaddi, that is the throne. A conflict arose over the right of succession between the eldest son and the son of the eldest wife. It is believed that the faction led by the eldest Maharani influenced the Peshwa's decision to select her son over that of the eldest son. Unfortunately, there are no official records to prove it. There are many such evidences in the 18th century to illustrate that rules of primogeniture succession were subject to influential manipulation that emerged from the conflict of ties of blood, affection, and power within the Zanana. Aristocratic women were particularly well placed to influence these processes. Since 1776, Maratha records of the Baroda state substantiate the important role played by princesses in political affairs. Quite often, they acted as informers for their patrons, including their husbands, fathers, brothers, and brother-in-laws. Gajrabai provided her father, Fateh Singh Rao I, military intelligence on the movement of rival armies of Scindia and Holkar against him. Besides her involvement in politics, she also managed the affairs of the palace. In many 18th century states, a dense network of marriage links with the banking and military families placed them in very strategic positions. In Western India, certainly women could and did pursue these opportunities in shifting alliances of the 18th century politics. Women, royal women such as Tarabai Bhosle, Ahilyabai Holkar, and Tulsabai Holkar all ruled for long periods as widows or regents. Gopika Bai Gaikwad, the wife of Maloji Rao Gaikwad of Sankhera, was the de jure ruler of the region. She was in constant communication with her brother-in-law, Fateh Singh Rao. In one such communication, she demanded compensation for the losses that her armies had suffered in a battle against the Kohlis. After refusal from the Gaikwad Darbar, she unsuccessfully approached the British. After the death of Govind Rao Gaikwad in 1800, there ensued a power struggle between two of his wives, Gajrabai and Gahnabai, each trying to secure the throne or the gaddi for their sons, Kanoji and Anand Rao, respectively. Gahnabai emerged victorious. She was politically active during her husband's reign and continued to be so even during her son's rule. Her political involvement went beyond the Baroda state to protect the interests of her blood relatives. British opinions regarding the Maharanis varied according to their colonial needs. In 1806, they made a positive statement. I'll quote, although Gahnabai possessed very considerable influence over the late Govind Rao, yet she does not appear to have abused it. Later, the British very conveniently excused the attempts of the Maharani to gain more powers and deemed her as being power hungry. It is important to contextualize women's political participation within the ambit of British interests, their administrative policies, and of course, above all, the patriarchal notion of male rulership rules. Women who were in power, who were in position of political power in the Indian states, not yet absorbed into company territory, appear in the records as, I'll quote, a succession of obstinate old dodgers or intriguing regents who have somehow to be got rid of for their feminine incompetence or sexual misdemeanors. Later in the century, colonial officials found a more effective way to sever the links that remained in the Indian states between the court women and the exercise of political power by transferring young princes and future rulers into closely supervised and masculine worlds of the new Indian public schools, or sending them abroad for further education. In 1844, Sleeman complained that in India, there are no universities or public schools in which young men might escape, as we do in Europe, from innovating and stultifying influence of the Zenana. Therefore, if there were many areas in which the company's government and the Indian elite sought to preserve tradition, women's participation in politics was not one of them. Rather, the 19th century saw the gradual removal of women from exclusive masculine public worlds of politics and administration. It should be noted that in the first 2 decades of the 19th century, women of the royal family had to indulge in a number of intrigues. Why? They disliked the British interference in the state's internal affairs, were trying to counter them, especially the financial reforms. Those were talking or indulging in curtailment of the expenditures of the Morikana, that is the royal household. Taktabai, the wife of Maharaja Anandrao Gaikwad, was politically active and highly influenced his decisions. She was aware of the threat posed by the growing power of the British. Eliot, the tutor of Nawab III, mentioned that she schemed against them by allying with the Pathan mercenaries. The British curtly warned her against such involvement. She, being a pragmatic, withdrew from the alliance, but whenever she found an opportunity, she supported her own countrymen over the foreigners. Taktabai tried to negotiate with the British to secure her son's right to the Gaddi, but was not successful. She was not the only Maharani who was disappointed by the appointment of Sayajirao II after her husband's death in 1870. Radhabai, the widow of Fateh Singh Rao II, the regent, was equally upset, as she wanted to forward the claim of her adopted son, Govind Rao. The British countered her claim, and she was only allowed the right to the property of her deceased husband. Maharaja Khanderao Gaikwad died in 1870 without a male heir. At that time, Maharani Jamnabai was 3 months pregnant. All the elites of the state were hoping for a male child so that they would not have to endure the notorious Mallarao Gaikwad, the younger brother of late Khanderao Gaikwad. In fact, he was imprisoned at Padra on the charges of attempt to assassinate Khanderao Gaikwad. Jamnabai, she was fearful of his dubious actions, so she sought protection of the British government and lived in the residence bungalow until the end of her pregnancy. Unfortunately, she delivered a baby girl. In July 1870, thereafter she opted to move to her native home in Pune. In 1872, Jamnabai presented a memorial of grievances against Maharaja Mallarao Gaikwad to the British government, which of course went unheeded. 3 years later, Maharaja Mallarao Gaikwad was deposed and exiled to Madras on grounds of misrule and mismanagement. Now, the British sought out Maharani Jamnabai and reintroduced her right to adoption. She returned to Baroda and she adopted a son with the approval of the British, who was given the name of Sayaji Rao III. Jamnabai's achievements, like other women, have been overlooked, and she has just become a cipher in the shadows of the achievements of Maharaja Sayaji Rao III. She not only stood up to Maharaja Mallarao Gaikwad, but also to great interest in good governance of the state. She undertook work of the Kamadhia department, that is the Department of Public Affairs, and attempted to introduce new systems. She is also believed to have taken keen interest in the health affairs of the state. Later on, Maharani Jamnabai the first wife of Sayaji Rao III, unfortunately, passed away at a very young age in childbirth. Sayaji Rao III gets married in 1885 to a princess, Gajrabai, who was given the title of Jamnabai II. Sayaji Rao III, as you know, was a very progressive ruler. He needed a partner who would complement him in the project of modernization of the Baroda state. With this objective in mind, he ensured that the young Jamnabai II was tutored well. And she measures up to that. Jamnabai II, she traveled along with her husband widely in India as well as abroad. These travels widened her outlook, and she developed a keen interest in music, art, literature, politics, and various sports. In fact, she was accomplished in playing sitar and took to roller skating and lawn tennis. She was also an excellent shot and accompanied the Maharaja on numerous hunting expeditions. Maharani Jamnabai was very conscious of the plight of women in Indian society, and her exposure to gender affairs in the West influenced her. In the preface of her book in 1912, she lamented that the cooperation which exists between Western men and women in public affairs is practically unknown in India. She was also engaged in pioneering women's organizations at all India level and also within the Baroda state to make women more self-reliant. For instance, Jamnabai Stri Udyogalaya, Jamnabai Stri Samaj. She also took great interest in women's education by donating towards the establishment of Jamnabai Mahila Pathshala in 1920. The crowning glory of her career of the enlightened Maharani came in 1927 when she was unanimously elected by the women leaders of India as the first president of the All India Women's Conference held at Pune. In a presidential address, she examined various obstacles to the progress of women, advocated compulsory primary education for girls, and the prohibition of child marriage. She also commented on other evils, social evils, that permeated Indian society, which were, of course, extremely detrimental to the advancement of women. Not only that, she was also very fond of reading, and one of her favorite books was The Duty of Man, written by the Italian patriot Mazzini. And the fire of Mazzini's words, his simple and personal philosophy, went straight to her heart. She was conscious even of the finances at her disposal, and she did not take them for granted. She made investments of over 1 lakh rupees in various companies, especially those paying very high dividends. She invested in railway companies, in banks, coal mine companies, and power companies. Her personal manager kept her financial records and regularly corresponded with the Income Tax Department, Huzur Kacheri's office, and the British Income Tax Department. Many times, she had differences of opinion regarding income tax with the government of Bombay, and she bravely fought it to get her rights. Therefore, now we can see that Maharanis of the Baroda state over several generations assertively defended their rights and interests. Their leadership in political, legal, and economic affairs exemplified the significant role played both by elite women and well as common women, and set them on a path of progression and modernization. In fact, they laid the foundations on which strong and charismatic women such as Hanta Mehta brightened the skies of public sphere in India. We all are aware she was the first female vice-chancellor of a university in India, the very famous, the Maharajas University of Baroda. In my concluding remark, I can only say, history of humankind can be comprehensively presented only by conceptualizing and authoring a well-balanced, gendered history of all civilizations. Now, there are many details which I have not presented in this lecture due to the paucity of time. Kindly do read the article in detail and with great interest, which has been published in the second volume. Thank you once again for such a patient hearing.
Thank you, Professor Awasthi, as usual. It was really fun listening to you. And the information that you've given, I think, should be able to excite the younger audience, especially those who are planning a career in historical research, to really work in this particular field. Those of you who have any queries or questions can either type it in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself and ask the question.
For security reasons, the unmute option is not allowed, but I'll read out the questions. Binita asks, the history of the Nawab period is documented in Surat Municipal Corporation publications. It was indeed a great pleasure to listen to the talk. She says we are documenting the built heritage of Surat extensively, and she would like to ask your help for pinning down the Nawab period architecture.
I think the question is for Moin. You'll have to unmute yourself.
I'm so sorry. Yes, I have to unmute myself. I forgot. Thank you so much, Binita. Is that right? Yes, I can see that. For your question, the history of, thank you very much. You're documenting built heritage of Surat extended. Would like to ask for Done. Nawab period architecture. Yes, I think what's actually happened is there's a wonderful restoration of the Surat castle that has recently happened. By recently, I mean just a couple of years ago, and it's in a fabulous state. You must go there, Benita, and have a look at it, because the Surat castle was really the place where so much political intrigue, so much of Surat's maritime power actually resonates. And so please do visit that. It's absolutely fabulous, and I hope you enjoy your visit there. Also, please try and visit the Musafir Khana that was set up by Shah Jahan's daughter, if I'm not mistaken, Jahanara Begum. And it is in a very beautiful old Mughal style architecture. If you get the time, do visit that as well. I hope that helps.
Did you say something about the tombs, Moin?
Yes, I'm so sorry. And there's so many beautiful tombs of the East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, and they are fantastically preserved. Some of them are glorious to look at because they're a real mix between Hindu, Muslim, Christian architecture. And when you enter that cemetery, one is just blown away by how these fantastic, architectural layers have come together in this fantastic form. So do visit the cemeteries. I think there's a mausoleum of Khudawan Khan, who was a governor of Surat when the Portuguese attacked. And there's a beautiful little story of how a cannonball landed on his chest and he was blown to pieces. It sounds beautiful. I didn't mean it sounds like a beautiful story, but his mausoleum is beautifully carved, and it's a beautifully carved mausoleum.
It was carved up too. Benita asked another question. I think you know the answer to it. Who started the cotton industry in Surat?
Well, it was the mills.
Yes,
the mill was started by Mir Jafar Ali Khan, the Darbar of Kamadhia, who was the last representative of the Nawab family of Surat. And he started that in 1857, 58, if I'm not mistaken.
Good question.
There's a question from Sonam Soni. In your account of Surat, have you found any examples of women of the Nawab's family fighting for their rights? So I guess this question is for both Moin and Aruna.
I think there's an occasion where at the behest of his wife, whose name is Vilayati Khanam, Nawab Muinuddin actually resists the English East India Company, but I'm afraid there isn't quite a moment where the women are fighting for their rights. I think Arunaji's account is far more inspiring, and we need to take lessons from Arunaji's account on that topic.
I think with this question, I'm now inspired to move my gender studies view to Surat. And I think I'm going to need your help in that.
Sure, anytime. Absolutely, anytime.
But I think if we want to talk about early Muslim feminism in India, then we have to move to certain other areas. We have to move to Bhopal, which the country indirectly or directly ruled for most of its history by women. It's the only case of that in the world. And I asked the family story why one of the Begums put herself in a burqa, and the answer was that she married this Wahhabi, but he was a very handsome guy and she picked him. So even there was a story, and we have to look at particular families. A family that is involved with Gujarat is the family of Janjira, and one of the Begums of Janjira was from the Tayapshi Faizi family, and she was a great promoter of feminism. And we're going to talk about this more because we're going to talk about the fact that her brother-in-law wrote a whole history against the rule of men in 1930s, based on her letter to Queen Mary.
Well, all I can say is I wish we had more female rulers. We would have had lesser wars and far more articulate thinking politically.
And they were
I
even
agree
better at
with you
leading
there
wars.
300%.
Okay, there is one more question by Bharat Diora. So, very good evening. My query is that the Peshwa and the Gaikwad had divided the revenues of Surat in 1750. Do you think the Gaikwad had rallied behind the Nawab of Surat to protect their revenues? I think this is for Moin.
Thank you, Bharat. Is it Bharat?
It's
Yeah.
Bharat, I think.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your question, Bharat. There were power dynamics that were playing out there. Surat was a incredibly rich city, not just city, incredibly rich province. And there must have been power dynamics, quite like in any other region. With the collapse of the Mughal Empire, everyone was jostling for their space. There were deals being struck, there were treaties being made. What could you do for me that I could do for you? All of that happened, and it still happens today in any political scenario. So I wouldn't be surprised if that must have been the reason. But the truth is that the Nawab of Surat, the Gaikwad of Baroda, and the Nizam of Hyderabad come together to challenge the East India Company, and this is a lesser known fact of history. And we're all students of history here, and one can only hope and wonder is that if that alliance had held on for a longer time, how different history would have been.
I think we can take the last, I think it's just an observation by Meher Mistry. So the question I think you read on your screen, the English East India Company got control over Surat Castle. And after 1759, the Nawab was already facing a lot of hurdles in his power. And this was almost a dual governance in Surat. I think Lakshmi Subramanian's work is talking about it. And she's written an article, in fact, 2 of them. So she does talk about this particular aspect of it. It's just an observation, I think.
Sure.
If you want to just talk about it.
Well, yes, you're right. In 1759, the castle falls, and that is the first toehold, if you wish, or more than toehold, or maybe the first foot through the door that the East India Company gains in Surat. And then it's just a matter of time, their continuous interference. Let's not forget that, the English East India Company, the Dutch, the Portuguese, they had an enormous maritime power all along the coast of India. None of the Indian Nawabs, Rajas, Maharajas had that kind of maritime firepower. Yes, they were strong in land and they had their armies and they had all of that. But when it comes to the seas, maybe a little fleet here and a little fleet there. But to compare that kind of firepower that the English East India Company had on the back of Wellesley, whose younger brother went on to defeat Napoleon, that kind of firepower of the maritime or maritime strength was unmatched, unquestionably. So when the castle falls in 1759, you can imagine the port is strangled by blockages of the English ships. And it's only a matter of time that they keep pushing in and pushing in and pushing in into the main city of Surat. So you're absolutely right. It is after 1759 that you see the steady decay of Indian power in Surat and the rise of the East India Company, the ascendancy of their power.
I think you're right, Moin, and I think we have to take it into looking at the decline of power and the waning power of places like Savantwadi, of the Wegas of Okramando, of Janjira in particular, because remember, the Nawabs of Janjira came as the Siddhis to Surat and were big powers in Surat. And because in the 17th century, they were named the chief Mughal admirals. And they were based in Surat, and they built a dependency in another area of Gujarat as well.
Yes.
So, but the change in fire, we really have to ask ourselves why the Angriers and why Savatwadi and to a lesser extent even Kolhapur, why these places did not do well. We also have to go away from the idea that Indians did not ever take to the sea, because what I learned was that Gandhi was the first Indian to ever leave India. That's what I learned in school in America. And that was his great contribution. The Indians didn't have any navies, they didn't have anything. And we really have to understand these things much better. And we have to go all over the coast to Tuluva country. The work has not been done on the Queens and Tuluva and their naval powers as well.
That's right. That's right. No, those are very valuable comments.
Okay, I think we should call it a day. I thank all of you for joining today, and we shall meet again on Monday for the next session. So till then, I think I'll say good night and good evening and good morning to everyone here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Maitri. Thank you, Dr. Avasti. What a great
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Again.
Great pleasure
Thank you,
meeting
Moin.
you all.
Yes,
We
and
need to meet up some more time.
Hopefully when I visit India, I would love to see all of you.
Sure, sure. We will also look forward to meeting you.
All the best.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Good evening.
Thank you, Aruna.
Thanks, Ken.